You're live. And then we first this, double check. Yep.
We're good. All right. All right. Welcome everybody. Everybody here in the library with us. Anybody watching on the live YouTube stream to another one of what we are calling our NicTALKS, our academic talks here in the library. I'm Nick Galante. Behind the camera, making sure everything runs smoothly, is my colleague Nicole Rivera.
As I tried to get in camera, there it is.
There she is. We're really honored today. We have Dr. Braun Strumfels back again with her colleague Dr. Daniele Fiorentino, all the way from Roma Tre University, to talk about Italian-U.S. relations. So you may have noticed, those of you that have tuned into our NicTalks in the past, our setup is a little different today. When we have multiple speakers like this, we like to have a kind of less lecture-y feel to it, more of a round table kind of feel. So I am going to get things started, and then I'm going to scoot right out of this frame, and we will just have a nice conversation with our two experts here. So welcome, guys. First of all, thank you. Daniele, thank you for stopping by to chat with us.
Pleasure.
Lauren's here all the time. So you guys you've been collaborating on a book that is coming out later this year, correct? So I think a great place to start would be just to hear something about that and kind of how that came to be, and what that's going to be about. So,
Thank you.
Should we start?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's start. Yeah.
So this is actually a good introduction to us and in our collaboration, because the book is, I think, a window right into the ways in which our work as me as an immigration historian and Daniele's work as a historian of diplomacy and international relations can really complement and enrich, right, the two perspectives from which we come, and also the way in which our transnational collaboration has also opened up new ways of thinking. So I have been working myself as a historian of migration in the archives of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I know my friends who were at the last talk and who have heard anything at all about my work are familiar, with some of the kinds of documents that I use. And that's not necessarily the thing that historians of migration, some people use diplomatic or consular records, but it's not like typical or common. And certainly not for a scholar trained primarily in U.S. history like myself, really, to be working with primarily in a foreign archive and primarily in another language besides English. So those were some things that, initially to say a little bit about myself. And the very direct story of how this book came to be is a silver lining to a very tragic story, which is that after meeting each other, I reached out based on your work, and I said, "Do you want to come and have lunch with me at the American Academy in Rome?" And
I did.
He did. Yes. Anyone ever invites you to the American Academy in Rome for lunch or dinner, you should say yes, because it's an incredible setting and the food is magnificent there. But I said, you're a scholar whose work we sort of we overlap in a complementary way. I work on Italian, the records and the activity of Italian diplomats in the United States in the Gilded Age and Progressive era, focusing primarily on the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. And you work on American
diplomats in Italy at about the same time, between the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And actually, it's kind of unusual. Also, I started with actually working on cultural diplomacy and how Americans living in Italy or visiting Italy between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th contributed to transform Italian-U.S. relations, and also to an extent the perception that Americans had of Italy and Italians at that time, considering that immigration was a major issue at the time, and it risked somehow obscuring, covering all the other important issues that were at stake. Also because Italy, little by little, and that's something we found out together, started contributing to the gatekeeping, let's say, work of immigration authorities that were trying to limit the entrance of Italians in the United States, because in order to actually control immigration, you have to have the collaboration of the sending country. So there has to be a collaboration between the receiving and the sending countries, so that somehow these attain also to diplomatic studies.
Yes.
Which is something, I mean, very often our two fields don't talk to each other, and we found out instead there were a lot of things in common, and that was, I think, the most important result, I would say, of our collaboration, also because we drew in the project several colleagues, both from Italy and the United States, who do similar work, but have never really talked to one another. So we put together a good and heterogeneous group, I would say, of people who found out that we had a lot of things in common, and we could actually produce something that could go out and reach to audiences that we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise.
Yeah.
So we started, well, basically, I would say from a personal relationship, I mean, sympathy, and the idea of, well, it's a good idea. Let's explore what possibilities we have to, finding out that we actually were building new,
Yes.
venues of, research, possibilities to expand our knowledge of what we were originally studying. By combining, for example, we have a couple of immigration historians from Italy who have worked a lot on Italian immigration to the United States, having a different perspective, of course, from the gatekeepers, let's say, but instead of the authorities regulating immigration from Italy, because Italy in the end contributed, realizing that it wasn't possible, to have all these people leave on a regular basis. We were talking about this earlier. Italy sent abroad, overseas in general, between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, in about 50 years, 8 million people, which was a fifth of the total Italian population. It's an incredible size.
Exodus, yeah.
It's an exodus, and it affected Italian economy, Italian society, and politics so much that Italian authorities started working in collaboration with the American representatives there, working on possible alternatives, of course, and solutions to this.
Yeah, so with that, all of the, in kind of sketching this, what began as kind of you're sort of like the opposite of me, and we might have some things in common over this lunch, evolved. The next step was that I applied for a Fulbright professorship hosted in his department of political science, and I won it, and I went, and then we were there a week, and then COVID lockdowns began to happen in quick succession, and between one day and the next, it was really pretty harrowing until I was given, it was about 2 days, right, of not knowing what to do, and then the State Department ordered me to return. I couldn't choose anymore, yeah. So the collaboration that we had envisioned unfolding over 4 months time with me as a residence in the department was no more. It evaporated, and so we were, in the same space in which we were all in that moment, wondering what implications this would have for our lives, right, both professional and personal. I realized, and when I say I realized, I remember the place and the moment that I realized as I was sitting in my bed, which was the only place that maybe was a little quiet in my tiny house with all my family members, right, as we were stuck inside with nowhere to go. And I thought, maybe something could come of this, and the collaboration that emerged, that is the book Managing Migration in Italy and the United States, that's the title. It came about because there was a colleague, Natalina Marinari, who is a historian of immigration policy. Her focus is the middle of the century, and she and I had been talking for years about how we wanted, as historians of immigration policy, really to restore Italians to kind of the framework in which immigration policy historians were operating. There were a lot of changes that have happened in the field since the publication in 2004 of May Nye's Impossible Subjects, which was a book that just really shifted the field in powerful ways, and with a lot of new and exciting scholarship on Asian exclusion, Mexican migration, and Latin American and Caribbean migration, and Italians kind of kept getting sort of pushed out of the frame. It was like, we know what we need to know about that group, and and we were really, Maddalena and I were really, wanting to enter into that narrative and see how we might be able to expand it. So we had never had all the scholars in the room know, right? Sometimes you keep trying to collaborate with somebody and it just never works out. It's never the right time. And I was like, oh, maybe this is the right time. And I reached out to her and I said, would you be willing to consider maybe a third collaborator in this circle? And she said, yeah. I was like, excellent. And so we were kind of, as we say, off to the races.
We started meeting online.
We started meeting online, yes.
Because of the COVID. It was actually, in the end, we made good use of a terrible time.
Yeah, sounds that way.
Because we were isolated, distant from one another. We had met briefly in Rome for, you were there 2 weeks,
I was on campus.
Right? About 3 weeks.
Two days before I was
a very short time, unfortunately. And in the end, it turned out, it was an opportunity to work on something new, something different. And I must say, I was intrigued also, I met Maddalena. Actually, we finally met. We had, at last, we managed to organize a seminar.
With all the
last year, with all the authors participating in order to compare experiences, our research and what we have found, right. And we met in June of last year in my department, and it was a very interesting opportunity also because we had, until then, collaborated with all the people participating in the book, just online. I never met Maddalena personally. We talked for a long time on the internet, but we never met. And finally, we managed to, it makes a difference, let's face it. Although we have managed to work online, throwing at each other all the stuff that we were digging from our research, and also finally using some of the resources we have found in the archives in a different way. Because until then, I had concentrated, for example, on how some of these Americans living in Rome, especially in Rome, in Italy in general, had affected Italian culture and policy at the beginning of the century, also because they created two of the major American cultural institutions in Rome, the American Academy and the Center for American Studies, one in 1894 and the other one in 1918. So, it's a very, intense and eventful time period in which, and at the same time, they're regulating, there are, these ambassadors who are supporting the establishment of American cultural institutions in Italy, who are working to limit immigration to the United States, and, and they don't realize that many of their connationals, Americans who are in Italy, are immigrants themselves, but of a different kind, of course, right? They are, for the most part, upper class, people who go there, artists, intellectuals, and the people who created these two institutions were Americans coming from Harvard, Princeton, had a different background, while the Italians going to the United States, as we know.
And primarily working class.
Right,
Yes.
working class for the most part. So, and we managed to, create this web, I would call it,
and that
of
was
different perspectives somehow.
That was a big part of what I wanted to try to create. Fulbright as a program, and Daniele is a Fulbright recipient, having the funds that enabled him to come to the U.S. and study here. So Fulbright is a reciprocal program, both sending Americans abroad and bringing foreign citizens here. So one of the things is always like, well, what's going to, they want these durable outcomes, like not just that you go and do something and then that's it. Like what networks are you going to build and how that's, in case anybody's considering an application, that's actually really helpful advice. But as one of the things that I really wanted to do was to bring kind of the Anglophone scholarly world and Anglophone readers in conversation with Italian scholars, and bring people at different career stages together as well, because the field of history, like many of the humanities, as we confront, right, and we're working on some of these initiatives here at the college, is the connection between the skills and the capabilities that humanists have, and then how to apply those in a remunerative way. That's a big conversation that we're having right now, and also thinking about the contribution, right, that we could make. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was to set up something that would allow people at these different career stages really to enrich each other's trajectories and experiences, to think about, at early career, okay, where do I want to go with this? How can I get there? And for the, more middle, kind of mid-career like me, or more, advanced scholars, to think about right, senior scholars, it sounds right. But what is it, what's the legacy, right, of your contributions, and how can we envision mentoring as an ongoing process that is not competitive and is not zero sum, where like, okay, I get the prize and you don't, and I'm not happy that you got that book published because it means I didn't get mine published, which is sadly, right, really a characteristic of academia. That's it often is we don't celebrate each other's wins, I think, as much, and our accomplishments as much as we should, because of the scarcity mindset that we've really been trained in. So I really wanted to directly confront that. At the same time, one of my larger missions as well, and I have a piece coming out in the American Historian soon, probably in the next couple months, about why U.S. historians should work not just with foreign language sources where relevant, but with foreign language historiographies. In other words, why we should be engaging with the work of scholars and scholarship produced in other nations and in other languages, which is something that maybe some of you might be going like, well, yeah, of course, but it really doesn't happen often enough, even among the historians of immigration and migration, where you would again think that it might be more likely. So these were all goals that we had, and what ended up emerging was managing migration in Italy and the United States. It's going to be published by De Gruyter. We specifically chose a European press. De Gruyter is the oldest university press in Germany.
And one of the major
presses, in the world, because we wanted simultaneous distribution in Europe, the UK, and the US. And we have our kind of final collection of scholars that are contributing. We're not attempting to be encyclopedic. We're not hitting like, okay, here's all the decades and all of the points, which some anthologies,
all the issues.
Or even all the issues. That wasn't our goal as an anthology. Really was to actually be really tightly focused around this idea of managing migration between these two nations, and that the ways in which they both work together and against each other, developed simultaneously institutions in cooperation and collaboration, and also in tension, right, with each other, because they needed each other to facilitate, right, this massive mobilization of people. But we wanted to be able to, really to talk about that using this decidedly, right, transnational lens. And we ended up with scholars from the US, Italy, France, and the UK as contributors to the volume. And we're really excited about it.
Also because some of these issues engage us in the contemporary world. I mean, we found out a lot of similarities. A lot of the issues concerning immigration are still there. I mean, despite the fact that a century has gone by, but we were we discussed with colleagues as we were preparing the volume some of these issues and how they look so much like what it was a century ago. Now with Italy in a different position, it used to be a sending country, now it's a receiving country that is implementing its own restrictive rules, and like the gatekeeping now it's in Italy in a way. Unfortunately, it's in the Mediterranean, and limiting and containing immigration after contributing to an extent to limit the immigration of Italian to the United States a century ago.
And we can think about one of our contributors to the book. So we have historians, and we also have an interdisciplinary scholar of migration who writes a piece that's about the contemporary world, Eleanor Painter. She's a postdoc at Cornell, and her piece talks about the language of crisis and how that rhetoric has become so embedded in how we in the United States and Italy understand migration and immigration in particular. And she traces the evolution of crisis in both countries really, and I would say probably in the last 20 years. So that piece we were hoping would resonate with people who are interested in these issues of mobility and the freedom to move. I mean, the phrase that kept coming up, right, and I have to credit Maddalena really with really pushing this forward for us was, the rise, and you all have heard me talk about this too, the rise of barriers to the freedom to move. And thinking about, for her contribution, she was someone who because she works in the 1940s and 50s, was really thinking about the framework of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, and then the definition of refugee that emerges in 51, which my European history class is looking at this week. So when we think about, how mobility, right, the human mobility is constrained by a number of different factors. But when you look at the Italian example and the Italy-U.S. relations in particular at the turn of the 20th century, when Italian migration to the United States was peaking, 2.3 million people left Italy just between 1900 and 1910. 1907 is the peak in the United States. The migration had also, like, South America was a primary destination kind of in the 1880s and 90s.
Right.
Argentina and Brazil, but what happens is that Brazil, so there was facilitated migration, where Brazilian coffee planters use these like state level organizations that to build nice landing facilities and subsidize migration. No one in the United States ever legally did that.
Right.
They did it, and that's part of the work that I'm doing now on immigration agents. But in that work ceased because Italy passed a law in 1903, a decree, the Prenetti decree, that said no longer can anyone pay the passage. So what happens to migration to Brazil? It tanks, right? Proving that these migrants, they needed that subsidy, right? So they start to redirect, and these are some of the flows. So when we think about the frameworks kind of U.S. gatekeeping and restrictionism are pretty well known in the field, and we think about Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Alien Contract Labor Law of 1885 that said that you couldn't sign a contract to work before you came here. People got around that, but that was always an issue, and Italians are particularly targeted, Italians, Greeks, for violating that law. With the padrone system, they said, right, with labor bosses. And then, then we think about the literacy tests, which first started to emerge with the Italians as the target. The test subject in 1896 will only pass in 1917 with 5 attempts. And then the restrictive acts, the quota acts of 1921, 1924 is just some of kind of that picture of the main highlights. Well, at the same time, Italy's passing its own laws. I mentioned the Prenetti decree. In 1901, Italy passes a massive emigration law, right? And that emigration law is in conversation, direct response to what the U.S. is doing. But it's Italy's attempt to try to regulate that exit. And so when we think about barriers to the freedom to move, we must think about barriers to entry and to exit, and the way in which these regulations emerge in that moment. How many of you have a passport? most of us, right? How many of you, you know, I think about how the process by which you obtain that passport, how you use it when you present it, you know, as you're traveling, right? What your experiences have been with that, and you know, and I know not everybody in the room carries a U.S. passport as well, and there's you know, some experiences that are shaped right by the citizenship that we hold, and our ability to move. So in that way, you know, the passport emerges right in the 1920s as this tool. But what were the antecedents? And that's what we're interested in particular, I think. Me especially, but also, you know, in thinking about this larger framework of like diplomacy and how countries negotiate these things is another major theme of the book. But we really want people to see how the rise of barriers to the freedom to move can be traced to this moment in the relationship between the U.S. and Italy, and how that sets forward precedents that regulate our freedom to move today.
Let's say that immigration history has been sort of confined to the margins of you know, diplomatic relations, for example, while instead it represented, especially in those decades that we're studying, represented a major factor. I mean, Italy inquires into the treatment of Italians, for example, between 1900 to the 1920s and 30s, with the rise of fascism. There is also a growing interest, also because fascism tries to change the perception that Italians have of themselves, of their leaving the country. You know, it's so much that, in fact, many Italian Americans become supportive of fascism, and at the same time, you know, fascism tries to negotiate with the United States a new policy, you know, a better treatment of Italians. At the same time, you know, there are Americans who look in a positive way at fascism because they think it's appropriate for Italy at that time in history. I mean, it's quite, it was, some of the findings we had are quite surprising also. I mean, we have an understanding of, you know, the reception of fascism in the United States that is really conditioned by World War II and the Cold War and our you know, later perception, while at the very beginning, actually, many Americans not only were supportive of fascism and saw it favorably, but they contributed
boosters,
also,
yes.
And
in case anyone isn't aware of the timeline in the room, right? So fascism emerges in Italy in 1922 with the March on Rome. So the system is formed. It first emerges in Italy before it
in fact, now I'm
right
now I'm here in the United States also because I'm working on the years between the end of World War I and the beginning of fascism, the rise of fascism, because it's a time that has not been covered much by historians. And it's sort of, there is sort of a hole with the assumption that Italy and the United States sort of distanced themselves because Italy was resentful of how it had been treated at the end of World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, while actually there was a lot of work being done, you know, in support of the most conservative sections of the country by the Americans who lived in or worked in Italy at that time. So, I mean, this is pushing us to reconsider some of the, you know, most shared division, the perceptions and understandings and interpretations of the of how Italian-American relations worked at the time of the rise of fascism. There was much more sympathy than
we might want to.
Maybe we might even want to believe or remember.
Well, I mean, I
incredible
mentioned this,
story of this diplomat.
Well, this the American ambassador, I can tell you the name also, Richard Washburn Child, the American ambassador to Rome between 1921 and 1925. He basically fell in love with Mussolini and fascism. And he wrote a book. He interviewed Mussolini several times, and then wrote a book which was authorized by the Department of State, because he writes, I found the correspondence between the ambassador and the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, in which the child asks for permission to publish this book, which is basically a praise of Mussolini. And the Secretary of State says, okay, No problem. It's
Just
not in
contrary
conflict,
to-
And what
which
year
is
was that?
contrary to any diplomatic rule. I mean, you can sympathize, but you shouldn't support a system or a regime, let alone a fascist one, but by a democratic country. So, this makes us reconsider some of our common knowledge, shared knowledge about.
Do you happen to know offhand what year that was that book was published?
The book came out in 1925.
Okay.
As he was coming back to the United States.
Okay.
Actually, he had this, let's say, this sensitivity not to publish it as he was still working as ambassador, but shortly after.
Okay.
So, but
Still, it has
it's
a seal of approval
and
of
he presents
Secretary of
it.
State.
I mean, if you read the book, the introduction, he says this is actually an autobiography. This is how Mussolini would depict himself in English. It's quite interesting.
sympathetic. Wow. But then this becomes, it's kind of a primary source.
This correspondence had not been checked also because there is another ambassador in between, in the most critical time between 1920 and 1921, when Italy withdraws from the Versailles Conference, is offended by the treatment received, especially by Wilson. There is a hole because the American ambassador at that time, Thomas Nelson Page, resigned in contrast with Wilson because he was supportive of the Italian claims. So it was more, these ambassadors were pro-Italian. It's quite interesting, and they work in the best interest of the hosting country. So in the middle, there is this new guy whom I barely knew about, actually, and I found out in this last trip.
Just last week.
And there was Johnson, who stayed for a year and did a lot of work for probably fostering the American point of view and a more balanced position, let's say, of the American government in Italy.
And that's one difference when we think about U.S.-Italian relations. So I know we've been talking a lot about the diplomatic relations. We also want to talk about cultural contemporary relations
Absolutely.
As well. But just kind of to say maybe a little anecdote, but that illustrates some of the difference in some of the work that we do and why it's helpful for us to be in conversation is, so because of the American system, right, the diplomats posted in Rome rotate, they change every 4 years and sometimes sooner. Well, the exact opposite is true for Italian diplomats in the United States. They serve very long terms.
Not as much anymore.
Not as much anymore. That's true. That's true. But in the period that I look at, so in my book that comes out in November, I kind of trace the rise of the relationship between Italy and the United States through the growing migration, through the eyes of this one diplomat who's initially sent to Washington in 1881. He serves from 1881 to 1901. An incredibly tumultuous and powerful time in the relationship between the two nations. But when he initially is assigned to Washington, he is pissed. He's like, it's a backwater. I don't want to go there. He thinks he's being punished because
there was the
Saverio Fava, yes.
Until the 1920s.
Well, in particular, he had been, when he started his career, and this tells you a little bit also about the history of Italian unification and the political tensions. Saverio Fava had started his career in the service of the kingdom of he's in the kingdom of Two Sicilies. He's the Bourbon kingdom. And I think he had one post, he was young, he had one post maybe, and then the War of Unification, and the king that he served absconds and says, gives up basically to the soldiers for unification. And so he felt like, he then continues his career in the service of the Italian nation as it's emerging, that the leaders didn't really trust him. They didn't really think he was loyal, to them and their cause. As the kings, then come from initially, right, the line that comes from the center of the country that leads, the initial political push for unification. And so I think also that reminds us as well that, like, the story, maybe this is a good transition actually, thinking about cultures, that the story of Italy is not of it's not of a monolithic country. It's not of a unified culture, a unified language, a unified perspective. You know, any of the things that I think we tend to think about when we consider Italy. And as I've tried to look with some subtlety myself as an outside observer who spent a lot of time there, but who is still always going to be a foreigner, you know, and seeing some of those cultural continuities in places like I was saying, like how people park their cars in South Philly and talk to each other across their porches, and how they do in Palermo, and noticing, right, some of these incredible cultural connections that persist. Although at the same time, there was a breakage because of sometimes the dialects and the times in which people came here to the United States. But Italian American culture can kind of also be frozen in some ways in time. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the, you know, some of the contemporary perceptions. And maybe that could be kind of fun, right? If we throw out like the stereotypes, you were just talking about this with my students in migration history, some of our projects were focused on this, but you know, I think some of the larger stereotypes, right? Okay, so who are Italian, right? Italians eat a lot of pizza. Mafia, right? That's the other big stereotype. They're always doing something on the underground shady. They yell a lot and are loud, right? These are all the negative stereotypes. But then they also have big families and they love each other. I guess that's the flip side of the positive, negative of that big stereotype. You know, they have a certain, again, kind of like boisterousness that we see repeated a lot, and you know, the shows like the Jersey Shore were like the worst in that category, and really kind of emphasizing that kind of you know, almost like presentation. But I think it has to do as well with the ways in which also like an Italian American masculinity and femininity are presented in the culture, with the mama stereotype also persisting for us culturally and being repeated in many different films and television shows and other ways. And you know, even at the most basic, right, all of these stereotypes, you know, they persist even down to, I was giving an example of a children's cartoon that has a pizza chef, and like the kids go to the pizza chef's restaurant and he talks in a ridiculous voice and he's always just worried about making the pizza, and like that's such a one-dimensional portrayal. So those are, you know, some of the ways in which, right, Italian Americans are depicted in our culture. And so I was curious about some of the ways and some of the negative stereotypes. Yeah, maybe we can kind of say the equal, right, negative stereotype list, and then we can talk a little bit about what's behind some of these caricatures.
Well, first of all, in Italy, there is the perception that basically when you speak about the United States, Italians think about New York. So there's even, you know, it's not this area, not where I studied in Kansas. So I mean, that's a different world altogether. That's what I always try. Even people have a good knowledge. I mean, you know, well-educated people, but you know, very confused perspective. Well, I mean, one thing that you know, that there has been unfortunately a growing anti-Americanism in Europe in general. And that's related also, you know, with American policy, foreign policy in general. So there is this idea that Americans are very assertive, let's say, and sort of expect you to know everything about them without, you know, explaining. I mean, that's one of the
that everyone will speak English.
That they expect everybody to understand, and they speak English. And well, I mean, which to an extent is also true, because you know, more and more around the world, English is spoken everywhere. So, and it's a vehicular language, no doubt. But you know, the assumptions are made. I mean, there is, you know, I think very often there is a very ambivalent feeling in Europe in general and in Italy specifically about Americans, because you know, there is in a way an admiration and sort of, you know, appreciation of what the United States has been able to do over the past century. On the other hand, there is this pervasiveness of the United States, and the United States models consider that, you know, that many people in Italy assimilate American as a brand of, several products. So that's what I always tell my students also, consider, just look at yourself, what you're wearing, your backpacks, what you eat also, which is more and more American, although we have excellent food, I would say. But that's a stereotype. It's pretty true.
It's an earned stereotype.
But one of the differences,
So,
yeah, on the flip side, around the food, right? I said eating the pizza chef. Pizza is actually quite regional. And it, and
well, I mean,
differs.
I remember American friends telling me, that they had liked something in an Italian city and wanted to eat the same in a different one, and you don't find it. I mean, that's typical, I mean, there are dishes here that have become popular as Italian in general, and they instead are very regional. So, there is this confusion. So, but, I mean, it's mutual, as we know. I mean, stereotypes are common, and sometimes there is some truth to some of the stereotypes as that we allow. Yes, we allow. In general, I mean,
the gesticulation.
Yeah, we move a lot, as you see, but it's but as you really go deeper into, I mean, read the documents, read the exchanges between people, the cultural cross-fertilization, I would say. I mean, just think about, I mean, when I first came here as a graduate student, it was the 1980s. Well, you wouldn't believe how many things have changed in this country. I mean, from my perspective, for example, I lived in Kansas for most of the time because I went there as a Fulbright student studying American Indians. And I mean, to find Italian coffee or Italian spaghetti was a nightmare. I couldn't find. I changed my diet, okay? Adjusted. I went American. I mean, I adjusted to American food and American manners. Well, I mean, that's normal. I spent several years here, so I basically tried to adjust as much as possible. When I went back about 10 years, I stayed about 5 years. Then I came back a few years later, and there were Italian coffee shops. I mean, amazing in Kansas. You could find spaghetti, olive oil, I mean, stuff that you couldn't find earlier. So there has been a transformation, and somehow Italian also, probably also because I was more mature, I had made improvements myself, but my impression of the American perception of Italians had changed entirely. I mean, what was negative at the time, I felt, I was asked, for example, I started teaching here in the United States, actually. My first classes in U.S. history, where I taught them here in Kansas, in Michigan and Kansas. And I was also asked by students why if I were a migrant. I mean, because Italians migrate, basically. That was a stereotype. And I mean, my perception was negative. I mean, the impression I had was that Americans had a negative perception of Italy and Italians. 30 years later, now, the impression is very different. There are some negative aspects, like the mobs, the gangsters, but there are also a lot of positive ones. Fashion, Italian food, cuisine, coffee. I mean, there are so many different things that have become popular in the United States that carry the Italian brand, like the Italian coffee makers, Bialetti, which didn't exist 30 years ago in the United States. Now you find them in American stores. I mean, things changed over time, and I think also this, knowledge, mutual knowledge, to which, to go back to what you were saying before, the Fulbright, for example, program contributes, of course, really help us change perspective and, reformulate the way we perceive one another.
Well, I think, at worst, too, the two countries can often depict each other, right, especially in media, in ways that are simply projections upon which, right, the I mean, you know, the American character goes to Italy to find herself after a crisis. How many movies are that, right? Under the Tuscan Sun, Eat, Pray, Love. There's a new one with like where I think.
Well, because as I was telling you
There's a
earlier,
lot.
you know, Italy is exotic. It's a kind of, it's a beautiful. I mean, nature and, and the arts and you know.
But then the flip side of that, right, is that it can seem like Americans overrun, you know, and disrespect. And as someone who, myself, who is really just dedicated my career, right, really to elevating Italian history and culture here in the United States and the connections, it can be painful sometimes to see those, that, you know, those like when we think about, you know, particularly, and of course, the reputation of the American college student abroad, you know, which is really a nasty one, but which also reflects upon the cultural differences, right, in the way in which we relate to alcohol and family and going out and, you know, socializing and the kind of these sorts of social settings. But you know, I think that Italy has, you know, the history of modern Italy, of a unified Italy. Yesterday was a major holiday in Italy, and, you know, Daniele can tell a little bit about that, but that commemorated the Constitution, the emergence of the modern republic, and the liberation from fascism. And, you know, the country itself, so there's that, right, you know, date, there's the date of unification. Unification was not it unfolded right over a period,
it took a while. I mean,
multiple decades, because all of these other governing interests, let's say, right, had carved out these spaces within, you know, what is currently the Italian nation for their own needs and their own purposes, and then also the flip side had happened, right? Thinking about the role of the Pope and Rome in expressing, you know, its control outward. But Italy has often been this crossroads, right? That was that other you know, powers and sovereigns wanted, and so, you know, I think kind of the other side of that, right, is thinking about that both in a general way, right? We might say both the U.S. and Italy are young nations in that way, young political projects. We're also, both the U.S. and Italy, right, unified and had kind of a moment of national reconciliation and unification in the 1860s. With the Civil War.
I was about to say that.
So,
I mean, consider that the problem, I've written about this, by
Yes.
the way, about the contemporary process of, well, nation building, basically. The Civil War is the completion of the American nation building process, in a way, and Italy goes through nation building this exact same years. In 1848, you know, there are the big uprisings for the unification of Italy. 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the end of the Mexican-American War, which leads toward sectionalism and the split, you know, the break between the Union and the Confederate States.
Enables, right, this
Italy,
smoke of slavery and the territory, the question of whether slavery will spread to these new territories, which helps to work.
And Italy unifies, I mean, the official date that we chose, it's March 27, 1861, 14 days before Fort Sumter. So, you know, everything is so close. When you look, I mean, actually the countries are going through similar processes, you know, although different you know, historically different, I'm not saying, but, you know, there is a parallel there that you see across the Atlantic. Actually, it's a process of nation building, of spreading liberal republicanism. Italians come to fight, I mean, some Americans contribute to the, you know, the Risorgimento, as it is called, the process of unification of Italy, the rebirth of the Italian nation, and Italians come here after the unification is achieved. They come here and form regiments in the Union Army, and there are also Southerners who fight with the Confederates.
Yes.
So there are, I don't know if you know, of the Garibaldi Guard, which was 2 regiments of the Union Army made of foreigners, for the most part Italian and Poles. who contributed, fought in the Civil War, or the only survivor of Custer's last stand was an Italian, a Garibaldino, John Martins, translated John Martins, who was sent by Custer to meet General Reno's troops, but he had fought with Garibaldi to unify Italy. So, when we speak about globalization and universal values, actually, nowadays, we don't think that this was happening already over a century ago. I mean, there was sort of, collaboration and exchange in which many participated, and the Italian unification process then took many, as Lauren was saying, takes several decades, because eventually Italy adds also Venice in 1866, and then takes more during World War I, when retrieves the Trentino Alto Adige and Trieste, and tries also to get some of the Italian islands in the Adriatic, but then it loses. I was mentioning that at the end of World War I. I mean, it's a very complex process through which both countries go, and they know of each other. It's not that it's by chance, of course. I mean, there is a connection there.
Well, that's seems like a good place to kind of thank you guys for all of that. We still have some time, but I wanted to kind of turn it over to the room and anybody watching online. I know we have some people that are watching the stream online. Open it up to questions from the room if you guys are okay with that.
Definitely.
So
Yeah.
it's been a lot of talking from this half of the room.
It's your turn.
I have a question. Have you read Alberto Moravia's The Conformist?
Oh, the film. I've seen the film.
Yeah, I read
It's
one.
a brilliant portrait, a psychoanalytic portrait of someone being sort of seduced by fascism.
Oh, yeah.
It's such, I mean, you were speaking about the ambassador's book.
Well, I mean, there was a fascination, at the time in general. That's what Moravia basically conveys. There was a general fascination with us. I mean, let's face it, unfortunately, I would have, let me say, although I'm an historian, Italy invented fascism. I mean, we've invented several things, but this is not the one I'm most proud of. But, it started something that was unknown then. I mean, there was a poet and a writer whom some of you might be familiar with, Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was Italy's top poet laureate. And he was the very first fascist. Actually, some people say that culturally fascism was born thanks to D'Annunzio's initiative. And he was, he had fought for Italy in the war in Libya, and he was already in his 50s by the end of the 19 teens, but he had also fought in World War I. And he occupied Fiume, the contested city between Italy and the new Yugoslav state. He occupied Fiume, calling himself the most chief in Generalissimo, so I mean, and some interpreters, some historians say that he's the initiator of fascism, actually. Then Mussolini, who was much more political, sort of rejected that kind of approach and made it into a more political movement. But, fascism was something that could be fascinating at that time. There are a lot of Italians come from the socialist ranks or the democratic groups who go fascist because they're fascinated by it.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
So I am not an expert on film, but I taught a class this semester on Hollywood on the Tiber.
Okay.
And we began looking at Mussolini's support for film as a propaganda tool.
Cinecittà.
And then we didn't spend a ton of time on that, but we moved on to look at the Open City, the
Beautiful.
collection of films by the Fellini films. And we then, of course, the history is very difficult for students to embrace. And then so far in the past for them, and they're like, it's black and white and it's not entertaining and there's so many things about it that aren't appealing. But because the course was Hollywood on the Tiber, we moved right away into when did Hollywood show up and start representing, Italy and Rome in the way that they do in American film. And so their project was that class just came back from Rome.
Oh,
They were there for a week. And their project was to use an American film that was staged and filmed in Rome, but to then see what was, modified, presented in a way that, really distorts what was actually there. And since they were actually there themselves, they could actually see, well, that's not really right, and that's not really the fountain, and that's fake, and,
is there a specific movie?
That
they could pick whatever they wanted.
Oh, okay.
The oldest film would have been like, Roman Holiday.
Oh,
And then it go all the way up to, contemporary films like When in Rome, and some of the comedies, the romantic comedies and things like that. There's just really dumb films too, like Sabrina Goes to Rome and things like, there's just a collection of everything about Rome that was made and is made to represent what people think it looks like. And so, it really distorts, and that's what we're talking about. What is the distortion that Americans have because we're devoted to film and television? What is the distortion about, Italy,
Well, I
especially
think,
Rome?
I think I don't know if you want to answer this,
No,
but I
I'm
think
curious
that
your thoughts.
some degree of distortion is inevitable also because, when you're building a fictional story and you try to give, a summary of of the location and the place. Yes, I've noticed this in foreign movies in general, I would say, not just the American movies, but mainly the American movies. A totally distorted view of the city and how it's reproduced. But that's almost inevitable, I would say. If you want to, you have to summarize in a very short time a sense of a different culture, a different city, a different location. How can you do that best? Sometimes in order to project that image, you have to modify, manipulate it, knowing that you're doing so.
We took the class to the Cinecittà Studios, and they got to see the way that things are distorted. So the monuments are all right next to each other.
on the view.
Well, there is a movie that I thought was very interesting from the perspective that it gives of Rome, The Talent of Mr. Ripley.
Yes, that was one of their film choices.
The Talent.
Yeah, Talented Mr. Ripley.
Yeah, because there is a lot of shooting outside in the streets, and it's very interesting how I don't remember who the director is, but how he manages to summarize, to a Roman, it was kind of hard at first. The first time I saw it, I watched it, I said, places that didn't have anything to do with one another, and he's, moving from one to the other. They have changed sets, of course. It was evident, right? When I saw it again, I realized that actually it was a very effective way of showing a Rome that, a foreigner who's never been there wouldn't be able to see and understand otherwise. So in a way, it was a master way of reproducing it. Of course, it can be, at first for a Roman, it's a little
jarring.
Yeah, it's a little
But then,
jarring.
the
And then you
exportation,
realize
the
that.
exportation of like Sophia Loren, that's what Americans think of as, thought of as, the Italian ideal, Sophia Loren coming.
Yeah, I know, but that we are the second best country to make Western movies.
Oh, yes,
The
spaghetti
famous
westerns,
spaghetti
right?
western.
Spaghetti westerns, right?
Well, and then we had Sergio Leone, who made was a time.
Yeah.
Once upon a
Once
time.
upon a time. In
So
the West.
the thing is, though, maybe all of it is real. If Italy's doing it and we're doing it, then that is real.
Yeah.
Okay?
And one thing too, maybe to take it in a connected in a slightly different direction, and then I saw you wanted to ask something, is to think also about the way in which Italy and then Rome in particular, and the monuments in the cities become the backdrop for American tourists to
But that's
so there's this spot we have the Colosseum, right, an iconic building. It stood for 2,000 years. Although I took my children there, and don't take your children there in the summer because it's hot, and it was all this is a lot of rocks. What is this? It's a lot of rocks. To my then 9-year-old. But I'll say that there's some, I mean, it's incredibly, photogenic as a site, but there's a location that a lot of people take a picture from, and I have one of our former students, Rosie, in the program. Her boyfriend walks most of the days the same path past Costing. They live in that in that neighborhood to go to work, and he says that he sees people taking the same picture in the same location day after day after day, and he said sometimes he'll go on Instagram because he knows that's what it's for, right? Just you see someone take a picture, okay, they're going to post on Instagram, and he'll find the person, right, that he saw. But it's, and this is on, in a media kind of thinking about criticism in media, but the way in which, again, the city becomes this space upon which we just project, our sense of adventure without really ever delving into or asking to think critically about the culture.
Let me add something to this.
Yeah.
I used to have a Vespa. You know what a Vespa is, right? It's a scooter, famous Italian, iconic in Roman holidays, right? Well, you have no idea how many American friends I had to take on a ride of the city, of the center of the city, on a Vespa, because that's Roman holiday. I mean, and the imaginary, of Americans is that you take a ride. I mean, well, I've done it though.
It was thrilling, but yes, it is, and I think these images. So we're thinking about how they're used.
I'm just dying to say something about this whole conversation, the latest White Lotus series, which amuses me because it's very knowing in the way it. There are two characters in particular. One, the character Tanya, who ends up wants to ride on a Vespa. That's her, her idea of wanting to embrace culture because she just wants to live the dream. And then you have another family, and they're all rich, entitled, nasty Americans in the show. And this one family wants to go and visit their roots. So they go to the village to kind of reconnect to the family, and they end up coming up to the house, and these Italian women come out and basically just chew them out and chase them away. And they were expecting some sort of connection, and they don't end up getting any of it. I think it's a great show to unearth some of these kind of images and narratives that we have of the American-Italian connection, and just how fake and fictional, those stories are.
Yeah, and there's some things too, for me as a historian of Italian migration who works in Italian archives, who speaks and reads Italian, but has no Italian blood, and so I'm still, and again, I'll always that's when I began learning Italian as a college student. I speak with an American accent as much as I try not to. I will, and I probably always will. But at the same time, there's Italian Americans here in the U.S., right, for whom, they haven't retained the language, or it's gotten lost over the generations, or the language that they understand is a dialect language, which is different from the formal standard Italian, that I can speak and understand, and that there's this, I think, this sort of romanticism and this fantasy, right, about this is who this branch of my family and what their experiences were, and that in some spreads to many different groups, immigrant groups. But
we were saying earlier, I mean,
what does it actually mean?
Italian American culture is not Italian culture. I mean, it's Americanized. I mean, it's better.
And it's
something else.
regionalized.
I mean, it's we tend to think of it as something like it's a culture that has gone American to an extent. It's something else. I mean,
it is.
And very often, even, we said that. I mean,
Right.
The way, the food, for example. I mean, it's different. It's different also because it's evolved, in a different place at a different time. So
sometimes,
I mean, there is a lot of, there are a lot of romanticized versions of, as you were saying, of this relationship.
Or these ideas about what
Right.
it is to be Italian that really don't reflect a contemporary sense of Italianness, you know, and in some way, like, because when we think about the migration journey and the fact that, yes, there is this massive Italian diaspora around the world.
Oh, yeah, it is
and-
massive, no doubt.
You know, but how the, if any, resonances and connections remain, right, between those who migrated and those, you know, and Italians had a very high rate of return migration. As much as
Oh, yeah.
50% of Italians,
Yeah.
particularly in the period that we examined, came back. That is extraordinarily higher than any other group. And so that, when we talk also about, you know, thinking about mobility and connection, like, what does it mean, you know,
That's
to be a
another
return?
misunderstanding. I mean,
People
in many
get here to stay
cases,
put.
right. The assumption for many migrants is, I'm gonna go there to make the money, to come back home and buy land. I mean, that's basically the idea. It's, you know, Italians don't necessarily, I mean, the general idea is that they go to stay because that's a better place. Actually, the dream of many, they don't succeed necessarily, but it's to come back home. And, you know, also this, at first, at least, there was this tradition that although people had moved over here, they would go back to their town to find a wife, also because most of them were young adult males, right? Initially, that was, you know, then this changes too because of the conditions. There are not, but that's somehow the assumption, which is a romanticized version of your origins, your roots, you know. So, I mean, also the Italians who came here contributed to, you know, project this image that is not, that it doesn't necessarily correspond. Also because, as you were saying earlier, you know, they freeze in time their family tradition. And that was my experience here in the United States. Very often I met people who thought of Italy 70, 80 years ago, because that's what they were told by their grandparents. I mean, I was asked in the 80s in Kansas, I'm not asked anymore, but I was asked if my family owned a fridge. I mean, I grew up with a fridge in my home, so, you know, but they had the memory of 2 or 3 previous generations who had left Italy in a condition that was very different from the 1970s and 80s. I mean, of course, you know, people went, yeah, right, economic miracle in Italy. I mean, Italy is now one of the major industrial powers. I mean,
third largest economy in the EU.
In the EU, it's the 3rd largest economy. I mean, it's a major country, okay? I'm not to promote it, but actually sometimes it's embarrassing, I mean, the way. But anyway, I mean, our production, if you think about the Italian trademarks, you know, I mentioned the Vespa, Bialetti, I mean, there are so many, you know, not let alone in fashion. I mean, so furniture, I mean, we have, you know, production. But you know, the perception in many, and not just in the United States, I must say, in many countries, the perception is linked because of this mass movement of people that spread around the world. I mean, in Australia, I think, how many Italians live in Australia? In Argentina, half of Buenos Aires is Italian. I mean, this is the reality. So, you know, in a way, we ourselves contributed to, you know, spread this image, because as in migration, I mean, also, you know, the sending country has a share of the responsibility in creating certain standards and certain stereotypes, let's say, because
and one
that's
of
what you project.
the stereotypes, I think, historically, that operated to the detriment, right, of Italians was so this birds of passage phenomenon, right, that migrants would, their intention wasn't to settle permanently, and this is a phenomenon, right, we still see in, you know, migratory labor, especially thinking about countries like in the Middle East where there's actually laws, you know, so migratory laborers cannot naturalize and they come to do the work, build the buildings and then to leave. But when we think about, so Italians were, they naturalized at very low rates until World War I, and one of our authors talks about this actually, because then when they came back to Italy to visit or for any reason, they could be conscripted, drafted into the army. So then some of them started.
Well,
doing
there is a
national
lot
life.
of diplomatic work on this
Around
issue.
that, yes.
Yeah.
So you read the book also for a great essay by Matteo Fratelli on that issue. But what I was kind of trying to say was that the low naturalization rates then became a rallying cry for nativists in the United States to say, well, look, Italians don't intend to ever assimilate. They don't learn our language. They don't become citizens. They're Catholic. They all of their habits are offensive and problematic. They're mafioso. Another essay in our book looks at the origins of international policing and networks that coordinate, to find criminals across borders, and which are a major part of how policing functions today. And one of our authors, Matthew Boriglia, he looks at how the roots of this international policing cooperation came in some ways out of New York police officers wanting to solve these crimes in New York and going to Italy to try to identify, where were the roots of these criminal activities, because Italians must be operating within these mafia networks. And so he uncovers that connection, which has severe implications, right, for modern day policing and modern police departments. So there's, these phenomena have been manipulated and reflected and in different ways and throughout kind of the modern world. I think there's a question from
We have a question from one of our online viewers.
So Juliet asks, a lot of countries have legal troubles with the protection and preservation of old artifacts and monuments. What sort of issues does Italy have in this regard?
I'm thinking about the laws about eating and getting the fountains and the fines.
No, but not
as a
only
minor,
also the restitution of the works of art to
yes,
Italy
yes,
have been purchased. Well, this is a very touchy issue. I can tell you this is from other sources, not in my work as an historian, but also because I collaborate with the American Embassy in several cultural programs in Italy, American cultural programs in Italy, that the issue of monuments and pieces of art that have been taken from Italian sites, archaeological sites, also by American archaeologists in the past, the laws have changed over time and things are very different. So there are issues also, for example, with the Metropolitan in New York about the restitution of several pieces of Italian art that Italy asked for. But Italy, it's quite interesting because we had a similar issue with other countries, especially Ethiopia and Libya, because as an imperialist nation, Italy subtracted some works of art from those countries, and we are returning them right now. And there is a lot of there was some friction in the 1990s and early 2000, and then little by little, diplomacy managed to smooth out some of this friction and to find a collaboration, especially because of the police of both countries, because of organized crime, collaborated on other projects and managed to talk also about the restitution of works of art. So Italy is big on this also because we have that we detain almost half of the works of art in the world. So, which is, for a small country, it's quite impressive. That's the reality. And so it's a big thing in Italy, and it's something that the Italian government. I don't know about the current government. We haven't talked about this, but this is a big issue again because it's the most conservative, I would say, reactionary government ever in the history of Italy after fascism. So quite a change for Italy after many years. But anyway, I don't know about this government, but I know that the previous governments were committed to, retrieve some of the major works of art that have been taken away. And believe me, the United States is not the major country being actually France. Napoleon took so much of our works of art when he invaded Italy that, we are still working on it. And it's and most of it will never return, of course.
Yeah. The other side, I think, I see sometimes with maybe the cultural respect and disrespect. And sometimes, again, I've noticed, I'll say anecdotally, to the experience of like, there's people sometimes will go to Rome in particular, or there's other cities, Naples, or there's spray paint, graffiti everywhere. There's trash management is complicated, and so you see sometimes piles of garbage. Dogs walk on the sidewalk and do their business on the sidewalk, and it's not always cleaned up. It's a little better than it used to be, but as I recall,
That has improved a
but
bit.
that has improved a little bit. But there's this kind of sense of like. So sometimes you'll see American tourists that will think, okay, well, that's kind of licensed to do what they want and to desecrate, monuments in some ways or violate them. And the flip side of that is something, like I've been riding on the bus, 15 years ago I was riding on the bus and I had my feet up on the seat, as you do sometimes, just propping myself up, and somebody said, take your feet off the seat. The seat's spray painted, and I was kind of like, is this really the biggest concern, of cleanliness on this bus? But at the same time, and this is a little bit of kind of the cultural portrait of Rome, is that at the same time as you can kind of have this image, and those of you who have been there recently, and saw the cityscape, like there's shopkeepers, are out, they'll sweep every morning, they'll sweep the sidewalks outside of their stores, and they'll be pristine, and everyone dresses in a way that's very typically, especially well thought out and put together. It's like the body of the person in the space is curated, but
It's
be
the
just
collective
beyond
good,
that,
right,
yeah, but
right.
just beyond that, maybe
That's an
trash
issue.
pile.
I would say especially in Central and Southern Italy.
Yeah.
That's the
Yes,
difference,
that's
for
true.
example, between two different cultural approaches,
Mhm.
and they differ also from region to region very often. But I would say there is much more care, although I mean there is much more care in the northern part of Italy. Although, as I was saying, you go to Verona and go to Romeo and Juliet balcony, it's all scribbled, and and all the tourists want to carve their names in the balcony and or on the columns there. I mean, that has to do with mass tourism, of course, and the fact that people want to experience. I mean, you were talking about the picture of the Colosseum.
Yes.
I mean, that's something. It becomes sort of viral, we say these days, right? I mean, it's
but like a
everybody
virus.
wants to have that experience. Pardon?
Like a virus, in
Yeah,
that it
yeah,
sort of infects you but doesn't benefit
But I mean,
you.
even if you go to Pompeii, for example, you find it is true, as an archaeologist showed me, that actually also the Romans scribbled all the
I was here.
buildings. So
They said I was here.
yeah, I
in
was
the
here.
Latin.
It's an old tradition dating back to the Romans.
Themselves, yeah. But there are these new laws, so
Yeah, now
beware, you
there
cannot
are
sit
some
on the
laws
Spanish steps or a monument and eat your panino or your pizza. You definitely cannot get in any of the fountains because sometimes people occasionally will go for a swim in the fountains, and major fines have been carried out for that.
I would recommend not to.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
All right, I think we can get one more. We can do one more question, right? Right time.
Oh, go for it. You go.
Well, we take both.
I will take
We
it
do
across the
one.
hall.
We can do both. We have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
We can go a little over. It's okay.
Well, mine kind of goes in a different direction, and so.
It's your
like, you're talking to each other from different epistemic domains, and you talked about like expanding the narratives a lot within them, and I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, one thing that just occurs to me is that when we first started to talk about what this collaboration would look like with this book in particular, Managed Migration. So I'm kind of coming at it and saying, okay, we're going to do a migration history. So I already established that parameter, but then how would you push us in a new direction, and what would be, and in that way, one of the things
I
that you.
remember that one of the first things I told you is that I'm not a migration historian, so that I can help you with some of the work that I've done that somehow touches upon your topics, but I think that the most important thing is that, first of all, to open oneself to other suggestions. I mean, we are very often in the trade, I mean, as we are trained as historians in our case, you are so concerned about, the scholarship and the historiography behind you that you have to keep that in mind, and you don't see the rest. I've always been attracted by interdisciplinary work, and I think she has too. And that's probably the reason why we crossed paths and we met, besides her insistence about it. I'm joking, of course.
I'm a persistent American.
It was a fortunate meeting, let's say, and we were probably looking for the other's fields, and I mean, to expand our knowledge and our experience. And little by little, we managed to draw in also people who came from other experiences as well. Although we are at the very beginning, I would say. I mean, for the most part, we are historians. In this volume, we are all historians. Now we have
one exception.
Eleanor.
Oh,
Right. But we could expand that also because, for example, in Italy, we conceive of department work and curricula in a different way. I come from a department of political science, which is very different from what you would conceive of in the United States, because in my department there are historians, political scientists, sociologists, law specialists, economists. I mean, we are very interdisciplinary and we collaborate, in different ways. And so, for example, drawing in some, a sociologist, I think would be very interesting because you have to look at the social and economic dimension, for example, of migration, and also what this entails for diplomatic relations. Very often, diplomatic relations start from the economic and financial.
Well, and that was the root also of the regulation of immigration into the country, was that it was essentially just accounting in the same way that, right, we would count the goods that were arriving.
Well, I mean, the very first American outposts in Italy, of course, in the late 18th century, early 20th, were consulates to regulate commerce. And then came the diplomatic, let's say, political representation, I mean, legation, right? So you have to look at different aspects, no doubt. And I would say that we will need, in the long run, we'll need the expertise of other people who can go beyond, as historians are called upon sometimes to, reconsider something like urban development or, or migration processes by demographic. We can call on people with different expertise that can fill in what we lack in the way of, social, cultural aspects, although we historians always work across. I mean, I say we know a lot of things, very little of many, many different things, and, which is very often the case. I mean, we have to deal with, cultural, artistic aspects of things, economic, social at the same time, and try to draw as composite a picture as possible. So I hope that this is going to lead us in the way of expanding even further our, shall we?
Yeah.
I think we can.
And I'll say, just briefly, that as a historian, the more that I have engaged with interdisciplinarity, the more I have been able to better and more clearly and more convincingly define what it is that historians do. So sometimes I think we avoid the interdisciplinarity because it feels like it's like muddling or diluting, or maybe it doesn't feel comfortable. Maybe there's a couple of reasons that we might stay in our area, if you will, in our lane, and this actually, this is a conversation I must credit Kim Bowes, the archaeologist at Penn, who was the director of the American Academy when I came in, and we had this big panel conversation, in 2014 about the future of the humanities, and one of the things that, in conversation, that's when we were sort of articulating this, but I've really seen this to be the case. That was 2014, so almost 10 years ago now, that these conversations sort of began for me. But really thinking just about like what the benefits are to explicitly engaging, to deciding, right, to think about how other fields work and how their tools and methods might enrich our own, because it causes us in having that conversation and that collaboration to have to define what it is that we do. And I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, let me just add one more thing that came to mind as she was speaking. There is another field I collaborated with in the past, and we should actually draw them in as well,
Okay,
which
good.
is literature specialists. I mean, I always tell my students to read literature because writers can say things that historians cannot afford to say, because we are slaves of the manuscripts, right? I mean, we are.
Must have the evidence.
Yeah,
Yes.
right, must show the evidence, although we invent some, because you have to make the connections, but you have to prove them, right? While a writer can express something that comes from within, that is not, necessarily in a document, and it really manages to provide a perspective and an insight that historians cannot provide.
Final question?
Well, actually, it was really in light of that, because you had talked about how you were speaking some of the same language, but also simultaneously talking past each other, and so it was, I think, what shared language in many of ways.
Okay.
What shared language came out of this project for you that you now take forward into the work you do?
Fabulous question. So I have been, we were talking about what comes next for you, this morning. For me, I've got a very clear pathway the next couple of years in publication. So my monograph will come out, Partners in Gatekeeping, how Italy shaped U.S. immigration policy in 10 pivotal years, 1891 to 1901. That comes out in November. Managing Migration in Italy and the United States. Our collaboration should be out by the end of the year, early next year. And then after that, I'm contributing to a book called Rituals of Migration, Irish and Italians on the Move, which is inspired, of course, here at Cedar Crest, and one for the Dublin sophomore year experience next year. So sign up if you're an undergrad. And that focuses on the agents of immigration, in particular an agent in New Orleans who I discovered while I was doing other research in the diplomatic archive, and was like, and saw something that had happened with a ship that was detained in New Orleans in 1906 for a week.
Well, we spoke also about continuing our project.
Yes. So then there's also thinking about how we might contribute.
She has a lot of.
But then I have more, and I have my next monograph, which will be published by UNC Press. It looks at the forgotten solution to America's immigration problem. So it looks at Italian, what was known as Italian colonization or distribution policy in the American South. So also looking at these places that we don't think of as being really pivotal to the shape of immigration policy, the American South, New Orleans, right? Immigration, agents of emigration. So how is it that people with few resources become mobile? Well, agents of immigration help to facilitate that, but these are also the primary targets, right, for the 1901 Italian law, in particular, for the series of American laws and American enforcement against the Padrone system. So, and that's coming after that. And then I'm also working on a special edition of the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, and which will become a book that from University of Arkansas that looks at the 30th anniversary of an important book called Shadows Over Sunnyside, and thinking about this massive Italian settlement that was facilitated by the government in part in Arkansas. I think about the ways in which, right, the collaboration in particular has encouraged me to think about the business of migration, and the work of a up-and-coming scholar, Catherine Carver, has been really great in thinking about this, and also, how these agents of immigration, again, thinking about the barriers to mobility in that larger way, and the barriers to entry and exit, and how they function, to create a system that then ordinary people will operate in, right, and push and resist and change. And so that space between, so Kevin Kenny, who is a historian of Irish migration, among other things. He says that my kind of work is the social history of immigration policy. That's his phrase. I really like it because I think it captures, right, that even though I'm looking at what we call top down and looking at governmental records, I don't have a lot of ordinary people's stories, little snippets. I'm not a social historian. I'm not a cultural historian. I'm basically I'm a political historian. I have to admit it. But that means though still that there's ways to think about how ordinary people function in the system, and that I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful to have as part of our collaboration as having emerged. So yeah, thank you. That was a lot. That was
Okay,
like
yeah.
That's it.
Well,
That's it. We're done.
Well, we are out of time. So thank you guys again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody who joined us here in person, everybody who joined us online. I'm sure we could hold you guys hostage here another hour and still have plenty to talk about. But thank you so much. This is definitely our last talk of these for the semester. But those of you that enjoyed this one, those of you watching online, stay tuned. We'll definitely be back with more talks like this in the fall.
Excellent.
Would you like to know some numbers?
Sure.
So we had 13 people in person and
Awesome.
6 online. 5 people commented. Well, 2 people commented, but they commented 5 times online.
Okay.
There were 6 questions asked, and then 2 comments online that mentioned how interesting this was. And a thank you from
Thank you.
Juliet for answering her question and also for being involved in this.